Hello, and welcome to Very Kimberly, the healed side of codependency. When the girls would become 13 years old, the court would then take into consideration which parent they wanted to live with primarily during a custody dispute. So, by the time Susie and Kristen were entering adolescence, Joe had started heavily adding the pressure for them to choose between him and me, especially Susie, his favorite. However, I did notice that Susie had seemed to understand how her father really was, that it was wrong, and that she did not want to deal with her father any more than she was already being forced by the existing custody arrangement. See, when I had left Joe, I naively thought that he wouldn't abuse his own children. After all, Joe's abuse had always been directed at me or Mavis. But his abusiveness was simply the result of his narcissistic personality. And me leaving was not going to change who Joe was as a person. His tactics may have changed because of the change in circumstances, but the narcissistic behaviors and abusiveness remain the same. Kristen, on the other hand, now 11 years old, was fully engaged in competition with her sister to win Joe's love. Kristen had already made up her mind that I was the one who was the bad guy, and her father was the saint. And so she began pressuring me to allow her to live with Joe. But for 2 years, I stood my ground, knowing that Joe would ultimately destroy what was left of my daughter's soul. I knew that Kristen wasn't the one Joe really wanted. Susie was the one that he wanted. Kristen was just being used as a tool for revenge, even if she couldn't see that. By the time both girls were in junior high school and had gone for the summer visit with Joe, the reason for Joe's obsession with Susie and his hidden agenda for revenge became clear. You see, while they were with Joe in the South, Joe had called me accusing Jack of inappropriately looking at Susie. He said that she felt uncomfortable around Jack, the way he looked at her, and that she didn't feel safe around him. He said that Susie didn't believe that I would keep her safe. Jack then coached Susie into telling me herself that this was true. However, she would later attempt to contact me independently through social media. and later called me to clarify that she didn't feel safe around, quote, any boy or man, end quote, not just Jack. Jack had many flaws, but he was not a pervert or a predator, nor did he show any signs of being so. Jack was not the one who was addicted to pornography. That was Joe, and there was no indication that Joe had defeated those demons. I knew from past experience that whenever Joe made accusations of anything, he was almost always the one who was truly guilty. This led me to highly suspect the possibility that Joe was the real predator in this instance, which horrified me to no end, especially in light of the fact that Joe now had both girls in his care, and all he had to do was make a phone call to Child Protection Services and take full custody of both girls. It was a very indirect threat that I understood very well. Joe went on to acknowledge that Susie did not want to live with him primarily, but was quick to point out that Kristen had already chosen him over me for 2 years. It then became crystal clear to me that this was a revenge tactic to force me to allow Joe to have primary custody of Kristen and partial custody of Susie. I did not want to let Kristen go, but that is what she wanted. That is what she thought would make her happy, no matter how much I tried to warn her. And Joe left me with very little choice in the matter. After I reluctantly agreed, Joe never mentioned any suspicions of Jack being a predator again. Susie would later tell me that Joe forced her to go along with his narrative, putting words in her mouth that she felt forced to agree with. Susie would also later confide in me that her older stepbrother Nolan, Lana's son, would often act very aggressively towards her and seem to be grooming Kristen. To this day, and to my knowledge, Susie nor Kristen have any memory of actual assault. As a matter of fact, both girls would later reveal that they don't really remember much of their childhood at all, because most of it has been blocked out by complex trauma. But for Susie, the signs were definitely there. Joe and I had split custody between the girls, with me having full custody of Susie and him having full custody of Kristen. But I had insisted in the new agreement that each of the girls could choose whether or not to visit with the other parent. And the reason for this was because Susie had started vomiting all over her bedroom floor as we were getting ready to leave for her first visit with Joe during Thanksgiving, right after the change in custody arrangements. You see, when I finally got Susie back after that summer, she had become a completely different person. She was reclusive, terrified of everything and everyone, especially older boys or men. She was afraid to take showers, go to school, or leave her bedroom except to go to the bathroom. And she was absolutely terrified to go back to her father's house, but was unable to explain why. Throughout Susie's childhood, she was always a very funny, energetic, adventurous, and friendly character. But now, she was like a broken shell of who she once was. Susie was now down spiraling into severe depression and agoraphobia, and no medication, no psychiatrist or therapist was making it any better. All I could do was watch helplessly as my child fell apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Joe didn't put a gun to our heads and kill us physically. But after that summer, I felt as though I had lost both of my daughters. And by destroying the souls of my children, part of my own soul was destroyed as well. However, the one person Susie always seemed to have the courage to stand up to was Jack. Jack's relationship with both Susie and Kristen had always been strained, but Susie was the one who saw Jack as someone who was taking advantage of her mother. And despite her own struggles with depression, anxiety, and agoraphobia, Susie was not afraid to speak the truth, even when I was still in denial of my own codependency. She wasn't afraid to point out Jack's manipulation to me or him. Looking back now, I realize how much courage and bravery it must have taken for her to do that. Even though on the outside, she seemed to be crumbling, I now see that on the inside, her soul was refusing to die. God does indeed work in mysterious ways, because it would be that call of my child's inner soul that would ultimately prompt me to wake up from my mind's codependent sleep and start walking towards my own healing. I hope that you'll join me next time, and until then, this is Very Kimberly encouraging you to keep striving to be on the healed side of codependency.